The lion visits his dying benefactor. What happens next is unbelievable. The morning mist clung to the acacia trees like whispered secrets when Kiera emerged from the tall grass. Her golden coat, now fuller and darker with the wisdom of 7 wild years, caught the first rays of dawn as she paused at the familiar boundary fence. The scent carried on the wind told her everything, the same mixture of antiseptic, worn leather, and something else. Something fading. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had built her wildlife sanctuary on the edge of Kenya's Masai Mara, where the governed world met the endless wild. For 32 years, she had mended broken wings, healed infected wounds, and released countless souls back to their rightful freedom. But now, at 73, with cancer consuming her from within, Sarah had chosen to spend her final weeks in the small cottage that overlooked the very plains where her life's work had meaning. Kiera had been one of Sarah's first rescues, a 3-month-old cub found beside her dead mother, dehydrated and nearly blind from infection. For 6 months, the woman with gentle hands had bottle-fed her, cleaned her wounds, and whispered quiet encouragements during the long nights when fever threatened to claim the young lioness. When Kiera was strong enough, Sarah had done what she always did. She opened the gates and watched her walk toward the horizon, never expecting to see her again. That had been 7 years ago. Now, as if summoned by some invisible thread, Kiera stood motionless at the edge of the sanctuary. Her amber eyes studied the cottage where a single light glowed in the pre-dawn darkness. Something ancient stirred within her, not hunger, not territoriality, but a recognition that ran deeper than memory. The lioness who had once ruled a pride of 12, who had survived droughts and territorial battles, who had raised 4 cubs of her own, felt drawn to return to the place where her second life had begun. The morning birds began their tentative songs as Kiera approached the fence. Her massive paws made no sound on the red earth. At the barrier that had once contained her, she simply lay down, her chin resting on her front legs, amber eyes fixed on the cottage window. She would wait. Inside, Margaret, the sanctuary's remaining volunteer, stirred in her chair beside Sarah's bed. The older woman's breathing had grown more labored during the night, each exhale a soft surrender. Margaret rose to check on her patient, moving quietly to the window to open the curtains for the morning light. She froze. 30 meters away, a full-grown lioness sat watching the house with the patience of stone. Margaret's first instinct was alarm. Lions didn't behave this way, didn't approach human settlements without aggression or desperation. But something in the animal's posture, in the calm intelligence of her gaze, suggested this was no ordinary encounter. "Sarah," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's someone here to see you." The dying woman stirred, her eyes opening with effort. Through the window, across the years that had carved lines into both their faces, woman and lioness regarded each other in the growing light. Sarah's lips curved into the faintest smile, and in that moment, she understood. Kiera had come home. The morning air carried the complex perfume of the African bush, dust and dry grass, the distant musk of elephants, and something else that made Kiera's nostrils flare with recognition. She rose from her position by the fence, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The cottage door had opened, and Margaret stood there, her body tense with equal parts fear and wonder. Kiera approached with the fluid grace that marked her species, but without the predatory intent that should have accompanied such proximity to humans. Instead, her tail remained low and relaxed, her ears forward but not alert for danger. She moved like a creature fulfilling a purpose larger than instinct. Margaret had seen hundreds of wild animals during her decade at the sanctuary, but she had never witnessed behavior like this. The lioness stopped just beyond the small garden that surrounded the cottage, close enough that Margaret could see the silver threading through her mane's edges, the small scars that spoke of a life lived fully in the wild. Close enough to hear the low, rumbling sound emerging from deep in Kiera's chest. Not a growl, but something softer. Something that sounded almost like greeting. Inside the cottage, Sarah had managed to sit upright in her bed, though the effort left her breathless. Through the window, she could see the magnificent creature she had once held as a tiny, broken cub. Kiera had grown into everything Sarah had hoped. Powerful, independent, wild in the truest sense. Yet here she was, drawn back by invisible threads to the woman who had given her freedom. She remembers. Sarah whispered to Margaret, who had returned to her side. After all these years, she remembers. The two women watched as Kiera settled herself in the garden, her body positioned so she could maintain visual contact with the cottage window. Her amber eyes never left Sarah's face, and in that unwavering gaze was something that transcended the boundary between species. Recognition, gratitude, perhaps even love, in the way that wild things understand it. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, painting the landscape in shades of gold and copper. Margaret prepared Sarah's morning medication, helped her sip water, adjusted her pillows, all while the lioness maintained her vigil outside. Occasionally, Kiera would shift positions, but she never strayed far from the cottage. When the heat grew intense, she moved to the shade of a small baobab tree, but her eyes remained fixed on the window where her benefactor rested. Sarah dozed fitfully through the morning, but each time she woke, Kiera was there. The sight brought her a peace that no medication could provide. Here was proof that her life's work had meaning, that the wild things she had healed and released had not simply disappeared into the vastness, but had carried something of her care with them into their freedom. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. With Margaret's help, she rose from her bed and moved slowly to the chair by the open door. The effort cost her considerable strength, but she needed to be closer. Needed to offer her presence in return for Kiera's. The lioness lifted her massive head as Sarah appeared in the doorway. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the distance that separated wild from tame, predator from protector. Then Kiera did something extraordinary. She rose and took 3 slow steps closer, settling herself just beyond the garden's edge, close enough that Sarah could see the individual whiskers on her muzzle, the depth of intelligence in her golden eyes. "Hello, beautiful girl," Sarah whispered, her voice carried on the afternoon breeze. "I knew you'd be magnificent." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber that matched Kiera's eyes, something shifted in the still air around the cottage. The lioness rose from her resting place, moving with purpose toward the woman who sat watching her from the doorway. Margaret tensed, but Sarah remained calm, her weathered hands folded quietly in her lap. Kiera approached until she was close enough that Sarah could smell the wild scent of her sun-warmed fur, the faint metallic taste of prey, and underneath it all, something familiar and comforting. The lioness lowered herself to the ground in a position of complete vulnerability, her massive body stretched out in submission, her chin resting on her front paws. Then she began to purr. The sound was deep and resonant, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. Margaret had never heard a wild lion purr. It was a sound reserved for the most intimate moments, for safety and contentment and love. Yet here was Kiera, offering this most private expression of trust to the woman who had saved her life 7 years ago. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to that ancient song of comfort. With Margaret's help, she lowered herself from the chair to sit on the cottage's threshold, bringing herself closer to eye level with the magnificent creature before her. Kiera's purring intensified, a sound that seemed to acknowledge every bottle feeding, every wound cleaned, every gentle word spoken during those long-ago nights when death had seemed so close. The moment stretched between them, human and lion connected by something deeper than gratitude. Sarah reached out her hand, not to touch, but simply to offer her presence. Kiera's amber eyes followed the movement, and for an instant, she lifted her head slightly, closing the distance until Sarah could feel the whisper of warm breath against her palm. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, and in those 2 words carried the weight of every rescue, every release, every choice to let love go free into the wild where it belonged. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Kiera rose with fluid grace. She looked once more into Sarah's eyes, a look that seemed to say farewell and blessing both. Then she turned and padded quietly back toward the fence that marked the boundary between 2 worlds. At the edge of the wild grass, she paused and looked back once, her golden form silhouetted against the vast African night. Sarah watched until Kiera disappeared into the darkness, carrying with her the memory of the woman who had given her freedom and received, in return, this final gift of recognition. 3 days later, when Sarah passed quietly in her sleep, Margaret would swear that she heard, carried on the wind from the distant plains, the low rumble of a lioness saying goodbye. But on this night, as the cottage settled into peaceful silence, Sarah smiled as she listened to the wild sounds beyond her fence. Somewhere out there, Kiera was returning to her pride, carrying the knowledge that love, once given freely, never truly dies. It simply changes form, moving like the wind between the worlds of wild and tame, bridging the space between human hearts and the ancient wisdom of the earth. In the morning, Margaret would find only paw prints in the red soil of the garden, and a single golden hair caught on the garden gate. Evidence that miracles still happen in the quiet moments between heartbeats, when two souls recognize each other across the vast distance that separates species, and find that love transcends every boundary except time itself.